January 3rd, 1944, 30,000 feet above the frozen fields of Lower Saxony, the air was thin and bitter cold. Inside the cockpit of his Focke-Wulf 190, Oberleutnant Franz Stigler felt the familiar vibration of the BMW radial engine humming through his gloves. Below him, the patchwork quilt of German farmland stretched endlessly, dusted white with January snow. The sky was pale, almost colorless, the kind of sky that made you feel alone, even when you weren't. Stigler adjusted his oxygen mask and scanned the horizon with the methodical gaze of a man who had done this 100 times before. He was hunting. Somewhere in that vast dome of sky, the Americans were coming. If you find these stories of courage and strategy inspiring, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps us keep these historical legacies alive. By early 1944, this had become the rhythm of life for the Luftwaffe's fighter pilots. Every clear morning brought the distant rumble of engines, the glint of aluminum in the sun, the tightening in the chest that came before combat. The American heavy bombers, those lumbering four-engine fortresses, had been crossing into German airspace for over a year now, and the pilots of the Reich had learned to read their patterns. They came in formations so tight they looked like floating cities, bristling with machine guns, their bellies fat with high explosives meant for German factories, rail yards, and cities. And they came without escorts, or at least they used to. For the first 18 months of the American daylight bombing campaign, the Luftwaffe had enjoyed a bitter advantage. The B-17s and B-24s flew deep into the Reich, Hamburg, Schweinfurt, Regensburg, but their fighter escorts, the P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings, could only accompany them so far before their fuel tanks ran dry. At a certain invisible line over the German border, the little American fighters would wag their wings in farewell and turn back toward England, leaving the bombers naked and alone. That was when the killing began. Stigler and his comrades would fall upon the formations like wolves on a wounded herd, slashing through the defensive fire, picking off stragglers, watching the great machines tumble earthward trailing smoke and flame. The Americans were brave, there was no question of that. But bravery without protection was just another word for sacrifice. The Luftwaffe's high command spoke with confidence in those days. The bomber offensive would break itself against German defenses. The Americans would lose so many men, so many machines, that their will would crack. The losses at Schweinfurt in October 1943 had seemed to confirm this belief. 60 bombers lost in a single mission, over 600 men dead or captured. Surely the Americans could not sustain such butchery. Surely they would turn back to night bombing like the British, abandon this insane daylight crusade. And for a while, it seemed the calculation was correct. The deep penetration raids stopped. The bombers stayed closer to the coast. The German fighters had won. But in the first week of 1944, something changed. Stigler saw them first as tiny dark specks against the white haze of the northern sky. Bombers, as expected. But this time, they were not alone. Flying above and beside the lumbering fortresses were smaller, sleeker shapes, single-engine fighters, their wings glinting in the winter sun. Stigler squinted through his gun sight. P-47s, he assumed. They must have found a way to extend their range a little, added drop tanks perhaps, squeezed another 50 kilometers out of their fuel. It didn't matter. They would still have to turn back soon. He checked his altitude, his fuel, his ammunition. He waited, but the fighters did not turn back. They stayed with the bombers past Hanover, past Magdeburg. They stayed as the formation turned south toward targets in central Germany. And when Stigler and his squadron finally dove to attack, those American fighters were there, slashing through the formations with a speed and agility that caught the Germans off guard. They were not P-47s. They were something new, something sleeker. Their noses were longer, their profiles more elegant, and they moved through the sky with a predatory grace that made Stigler's stomach tighten. One of them came at him head-on, and for a brief, surreal moment, Stigler could see the shark's mouth painted on its nose, the black and white checkerboard pattern on its wings. Then it was past him, rolling away in a tight spiral that no Focke-Wulf could match. He radioed back to base, his voice tight with confusion and frustration. Unknown enemy fighters escorting the bombers, long-range, single-engine. Repeat, they are still with them past Magdeburg. The response was silence. Then, crackling through the static, confirm, still with them? Yeah, they have not turned back. There was a pause. Stiegler could almost hear the disbelief on the other end of the line. Understood. Proceed with caution. Caution. The word felt hollow at 30,000 feet with the enemy all around you. Later that day, back on the ground, the pilots gathered in the operations room and spoke in hushed, bewildered tones. No one had believed it possible. The Americans had always been limited by fuel and distance. The geography of the air war had been fixed, immutable, a matter of simple arithmetic. A fighter carried so much fuel. It burned so much per hour. Therefore, it could only fly so far. The Reich's heartland, its factories, its cities, had been shielded by distance itself. But now, somehow, the Americans had rewritten the equation. The aircraft they had encountered was the P-51 Mustang, though most of the German pilots did not yet know its name. They would learn it soon enough. The P-51 had begun its life as an orphan, a design rejected by the U.S. Army Air Forces and initially built for the British Royal Air Force. It was fast and beautiful, with a laminar flow wing that sliced through the air with minimal drag, but its original Allison engine was underpowered at high altitude. The British, desperate for any fighter they could get, took it anyway, and then made a suggestion that would change the course of the war. Swap the Allison engine for a Rolls-Royce Merlin, the same power plant that drove the legendary Spitfire. The result was a transformation. The P-51B, as it was designated, could fly higher, faster, and farther than any fighter in the sky. And when it was fitted with long-range drop tanks, it could do something no other Allied fighter had done: escort the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The German pilots had expected the Americans to be limited, constrained by the same physical laws that governed everyone else. They had built their defensive strategy around that expectation, but the Mustang shattered it. Suddenly there was no safe distance, no invisible line, where the bombers would be left vulnerable. The Americans could go anywhere, and they would be protected the entire way. For the Luftwaffe, it was as if the rules of the game had been changed mid-match. In February 1944, the Americans launched Operation Argument, later known as Big Week, a coordinated series of massive daylight raids targeting German aircraft production facilities. The bombers came in waves, hundreds at a time, and everywhere they went, the Mustangs were there. On February 20th, for the first time in history, American fighters appeared over Berlin. The pilots of JG-1, scrambling to intercept the bombers, found themselves outnumbered and outmaneuvered. The Mustangs were not just escorts, they were hunters. They chased the German fighters back to their own airfields, strafing them as they tried to land, shooting them out of the sky before they could even engage the bombers. It was a reversal so sudden and so total that it felt like a violation of natural law. Hauptmann Heinz Knoke, a veteran fighter pilot with over 20 kills, recorded his shock in his diary. "Where did the escorts come from? We were told the Americans could not reach us here. We were told we would be safe over the homeland. But they are here. They are everywhere." The psychological impact of the Mustang's arrival was immediate and profound. German pilots, who had once felt like lords of their own skies, now flew with the constant dread of being jumped by American fighters. They could no longer focus solely on attacking the bombers. They had to watch their backs, watch the sun, watch the clouds. Every sortie became a gamble. And as the spring of 1944 wore on, the odds grew worse. More Mustangs arrived, more pilots, fresh and aggressive, eager to prove themselves. The Americans began to hunt aggressively, sending out fighter sweeps ahead of the bomber formations, daring the Germans to come up and fight. Many did, driven by duty and desperation. Many did not come back. The Mustang became more than just an airplane. It became a symbol of something the Germans had not fully anticipated. American industrial power and ingenuity turned to a single, relentless purpose. In the years before the war, German strategists had looked at America and seen a nation of soft, consumerist excess, a people more interested in Hollywood and automobiles than military discipline. They had underestimated the speed with which that industrial capacity could be retooled, the sheer scale of production that American factories could achieve once the machinery of war was set in motion. By 1944, the United States was producing fighters and bombers at a rate the Germans could not match. For every Mustang shot down, 2 more appeared. For every pilot lost, 3 more were trained and sent over. The arithmetic of attrition, which had once favored the defenders, now crushed them. Stigler survived the war, but many of his comrades did not. In the spring and summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe bled itself white trying to defend the Reich. Experienced pilots, men who had flown since the beginning of the war, were shot down and replaced by teenagers with barely 20 hours of flight time. The fuel shortages worsened. Training was cut to the bone. Aircraft sat grounded for lack of spare parts, for lack of fuel, for lack of pilots to fly them. And above it all, the Mustangs circled like sharks, patient and merciless. The German pilot spoke of the Mustang with a mixture of respect and resentment. It was a beautiful machine, they admitted, perhaps the most aesthetically perfect fighter of the war. But it was also a reminder of their own failure, their own miscalculation. They had believed distance would protect them. They had believed the Americans would break before reaching Berlin. They had been wrong. There was a recurring image that haunted the memories of many Luftwaffe pilots in those final years of the war. The sight of a P-51 Mustang trailing a long, thin contrail across a cobalt sky, so high and so fast that it seemed untouchable. It was a vision of modernity, of technological supremacy, of a future in which the old certainties no longer applied. The Mustang did not just defeat German fighters in combat, it rendered obsolete the entire strategic framework upon which the Luftwaffe had based its defense. It was a weapon that exposed the limitations of an ideology that had prided itself on willpower and tactical brilliance, but had underestimated the grinding, relentless logic of industrial warfare. By the time the first Mustangs appeared over Berlin, the outcome of the air war was no longer in doubt. The bombers would keep coming, the cities would burn, the factories would be destroyed, and the fighters that had once seemed invincible would be swept from the sky by a machine built in a country they had never taken seriously. In the years after the war, Franz Stigler emigrated to Canada and eventually met one of the American bomber pilots he might have faced in the skies over Germany. They became friends. In their conversations, Stigler would sometimes return to that moment in January 1944, when he first saw the Mustangs and realized that everything had changed. He would describe the disbelief, the sinking feeling, the sudden knowledge that the war in the air was lost. "We had always believed the bombers would be alone eventually," he said. "We believed in distance. We believed in attrition. But you brought those fighters all the way to Berlin, and we had no answer." The P-51 Mustang flew its missions with a kind of mechanical grace, a fusion of art and engineering that represented the best of what industrial democracy could produce when pressed to its limits. It was not invincible. Hundreds were shot down, and hundreds of pilots died in its cockpit. But it arrived at a moment when the balance of the air war hung in the balance, and it tipped that balance decisively. It gave the bombers the protection they needed to complete their mission. It shattered the Luftwaffe's defensive strategy, and it demonstrated, with brutal clarity, that the Reich's greatest miscalculation had not been about tactics or courage, but about the nature of the enemy they faced. There is a photograph taken in early 1944, somewhere over Germany. It shows a formation of B-17 bombers, tight and orderly, their contrails etching white lines across a clear sky. And just above them, barely visible, are the sleek, predatory shapes of P-51 Mustangs weaving back and forth like guardian angels. To the bomber crews, those fighters were salvation. To the German pilots below, they were a nightmare. And to history, they are a reminder that wars are not won by ideology or rhetoric, but by the cold, inexorable logic of production, innovation, and the willingness to adapt. The Mustang did not end the war alone, but it broke the back of the Luftwaffe and opened the skies over Germany to a campaign of destruction from which there would be no recovery. It was a machine built in the factories of Detroit and Los Angeles, flown by farm boys from Kansas and college students from New York, and it defeated an air force that had once terrorized Europe. In the end, the question was never whether the Americans could build a fighter that could reach Berlin. The question was whether the Germans had ever truly understood the kind of war they had started, and by the time they found out, it was already too late. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this historical deep dive, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which historical figure we should cover next.